Good morning, and welcome to the Museum of the San Ramon Valley's virtual speaker series. I'm Dan Dunn, the director of the museum. First of all, Happy New Year. This month, we take a virtual journey through one of my favorite places in the Bay Area, the historic Presidio of San Francisco. The Presidio has a very rich history, from Spanish forts to Cold War bunkers, and we have a good guide. John Martini has been with us before. You remember his wonderful program on the Golden Gate Bridge. If you have not viewed that program, please go to the museum's website to take a look at it. It's worth a visit. John Martini is a native San Franciscan and a lifelong researcher into the history of California and the American West. He has worked as a National Park Service ranger for more than 25 years at sites around the country, including Golden Gate National Recreation Area, the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor, and Teddy Roosevelt's country estate at Sagamore Hill in New York. He is a published author and a renowned expert on the city's many military posts and the Land's End Sutro Baths area. John appears on local and national television and podcasts for PBS, A&E Network, the Smithsonian Channel, and the History Channel. John lives in Marin County with his wife Betsy and their large dog, as he puts it, Ziggy. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send in questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome back John Martini. John?
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for the intro. Well, just a quick word about why do I get to talk about the Presidio? Well, growing up in San Francisco, the Presidio was sort of our backyard park, even though it was an active Army post. And my buddies and I would go, we termed it screwing around in the Presidio, looking at the old bunkers, dodging MPs back when I was a young teen. When the Presidio was part of the National Park Service after base closure in 1995. I was working for the National Park Service, and they asked me to be the curator of the military history collection that had come over from the Army to the Park Service. So I ended up working on the post for the last 5 years of my career before I retired. I got to know the Presidio pretty intimately. This is how people think of the Presidio today. It's this wonderful green corner of San Francisco. Statistics, it's 1,491 acres. It's slightly bigger than Golden Gate Park. There are 870 historic structures dotting the post. The landscape, it's a man-made landscape. There's 300 acres of forest. We call it a what's the term that the naturalists use? It's a cultural forest because the trees are imported. They're not from here. They grow wonderfully, but there has to be a forester to maintain it. It's a wonderful resource. Its history goes back to Spanish colonial. And people today, I realize the Presidio closed 30 years ago, 1995. There are adults running around who never knew it when it was an Army post. They only know it as a park. In fact, one of the nicknames that keeps popping up is Presidio Park. No, it's the Presidio of San Francisco. So why was it here? Why was it established? This was the most far-flung outpost of the Kingdom of Spain. It was established in 1776, and it was occupied first by Spanish, and then the Mexican Army, and then beginning in 1846, when the U.S. took control of California, the United States Army. When it was established by the Spanish, this was the ends of empire. This was really the middle of nowhere. And the Spanish interest in this part of California was relatively late coming. This map from the late 17th century shows that as late as 400 years ago, the Spanish were still thinking that California was an island. They had investigated, they had sailed up the coast of what would later be called Alta California to differentiate from the Baja California. They had sailed up maybe as far as the mouth of the Columbia River, and they had never really set foot in the California that we know today, not in the 16th century or the 17th century. Wouldn't it be until the end of the 18th century that other people started to show an interest in the west coast of North America? Uh, Technically, Spain claimed California based on the voyage of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo in 1540, who sailed up the coast. Even though he didn't land at more than a couple of places, they basically said everything with that we pass belongs to the King of Spain. Well, they were going to have some other Europeans who were interested. Beginning in the mid 18th century, you started to have Russian fur traders making their way crossover to Alaska and then down the west coast of what would become Canada, trading with the local tribes. Seal furs, otter furs, and you also started to have more beginning in the turn of the 19th century. You had English, the Hudson's Bay Company showing up. And Spain was in the position of they were a waning world power in the 1750s, 1760s. And they realized that with the Russians coming down and the British starting to make their way across, that it was occupy it or lose it. And they decided that what they would do is they would establish a series of presidios along the western coast. Presidio is simply it's a Spanish name for a frontier army post. There were presidios in Monterey, Presidio Santa Barbara, all over the Southwest. And they decided they would establish one in Monterey. And they sent a group of foot soldiers marching up the California coast in 1769. And they went right past Monterey without recognizing it. No one had been there for over 100 years. And they kept going further and further north into Terra Incognita. And one morning, in October of 1769, they found themselves on a headland overlooking what they called a huge arm of the sea extending into the land. We would call it San Francisco Bay. What the Spanish soldiers didn't know was that they had overshot Monterey Bay. They'd hit this huge new inland sea. And they knew it wasn't Monterey. And I love the mindset. They returned to Mexico because they couldn't get any further north and reported that they'd failed. They couldn't find Monterey. But, oh, by the way, we did hit this other huge inland resource. And one of the padres described it. It was so big that every king's ship in the world could anchor inside at the same time. He was being conservative. Probably every floating ship in the world could fit in San Francisco Bay. More expeditions headed up, and in 1775, an expedition left Mexico, marching across the Southwest, headed for San Francisco Bay to establish the two things Spain always established when it was a new outpost: an army post, a presidio, and also a mission. The army post was, of course, to pacify the landscape and maintain control, and the missions were to convert the native peoples in the area. Because this, although it was Spanish had claimed it for 10,000 years, this had been the home of the local tribes in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Miwok people in Marin County, and the Ramaytush Ohlone, who lived on the San Francisco Peninsula. There were actually several hundred native people living in what's now the boundaries of the city of San Francisco. They had no idea they were Spanish citizens, or actually they weren't citizens. They were a Spanish controlled people. And they had new masters. When the Presidio of San Francisco was officially dedicated on June 27th, 1776, it all became royal land of the King of Spain. Again, I can't stress how far away, how far off this was from Spain itself, even from Mexico City. Months and months of travel were required to get to San Francisco Bay from Mexico. And the earliest form of the Presidio of San Francisco. An artist recreated this. It was a walled compound. Presidios, army posts, were traditionally they were surrounded by a defensive wall. Well, here in the Presidio of San Francisco, they never quite completed the quadrangle. It was a series of adobe buildings with thatched roofs, about 100 yards on a side. They meant 100 varas in Spanish speak. And it was because the local folks were not especially hostile towards the Spanish being here, they never really finished the fortification wall. That last side was pretty much just one report said it was a piled brush. What was going on was that the compound here, this is where the barracks for the soldiers were located. This is where administrative buildings and workshops were located, storehouses. And in the very center, with the cross in front of it, that was the Catholic chapel. But look immediately to the right, the circled building, that was sometimes called the Comandancia. It was the commandant's offices. And everything else would disappear in this photograph over the years. Adobe just doesn't last really long. Earthquakes and rains and just neglect. All the other buildings would gradually disappear, but the Comandancia stayed in use, kept being rebuilt, kept being modernized, and it still exists today. This is the oldest standing building in the Presidio of San Francisco. Although there's a sign that says 1776, the reality is that in 1776 was probably just a lean-to of maybe local cut willow. And over the years, it got rebuilt and modernized. And most of the building that we see today, well, it looks like a 1930s movie set because inside these walls is the original we think 1810s adobe, and it was clad in the 1930s with a more modern exterior. What the archaeologists and the historians have done in the Presidio is they stripped the interior walls of the Comandancia, and they got down to the original, they claimed in this caption here, 1790s, whitewashed adobe brick, rammed earth floor. This was rude. This was, again, frontier construction. And over the years, the interior would get replastered. It would get, under the Americans, tongue and groove wall and then wall board and be continually modernized. The architects figured the building had been remodeled about 30 times. And the last big remodel was in the 1930s when it got what I call the Zorro exterior. It was supposed to look Spanish. This is not how it really looked historically. This is way too elegant. But hey, in the 1930s, this is how they wanted it. It was decided this is how it'll be maintained. Its history didn't end when it was constructed by the Spanish. Its use continued up until base closure. And it's now a visitor center. It has a historic museum display. And of course, portions of the interior have been preserved as they looked at different time periods. In the 1790s, 18 years after the post was established, a British ship sailed into San Francisco Bay. Captain George Vancouver visited San Francisco. Actually, he visited the Presidio. There was no city of San Francisco. And he got a very nice reception. And he promptly replied back to the British Admiralty how poorly defended San Francisco Bay was. He said he found one cannon tied to a log at the Presidio. There were no other defenses. Although the Presidio was here, there was really no way to keep out an occupying force had the Russians or the British, or actually by the 1790s, the young United States from making a try on San Francisco Bay. So in 1794, a little tiny adobe fort was built on the furthest promontory of the northernest tip of the Presidio. And it was a tiny adobe fort. The Spanish, they didn't have hard-fired brick out here, and they sure didn't have concrete, so they were building with what they knew about in the Southwest, adobe, notoriously weak construction. But this little tiny fort that mounted at one time 11 cannon was called the Castillo de San Joaquin, the little castle of St. Joachim. And the cannon themselves had been brought up from Peru, where they'd been cast, in some cases, 100 years earlier. They were mounted in the fort, and there wasn't even enough soldiers at the Presidio to garrison the little fort. If they ever felt there'd be an attack, soldiers would have marched over from the main post, which is located about a mile and a half away. This model shows how it looked at one time. It kept melting, it kept collapsing in earthquakes, it kept being rebuilt, but its trace remains were there, and the cannon were lying in the dirt when Americans came and they captured the Presidio of San Francisco bloodlessly in 1846. There's not a trace of the original fort left. It was demolished and its location cut down by 50 feet to build the modern Fort Point in the Presidio of San Francisco. But that's where the name Fort Point comes from. When the Americans arrived, it was a point of land with a fort on top of it. And the Yankees didn't bother very much with Spanish-Mexican names. They gave it the nickname Fort Point. The name has stuck. The cannon, I found this astounding when I was the curator there. 6 of these cannon are still surviving in the Presidio of San Francisco. Some of them are the earliest cannon constructed in North America, cast in bronze, Lima, Peru, some of them in the early 17th century. These were antiques by the time they were brought north to San Francisco in the 1790s. There's a pair in front of the Officers Club, a pair at the main flagpole. One's at Fort Point, and other one's in the Visitor Center. These are real touchstones to the Hispanic heritage of the Presidio. I mentioned the Americans takeover. A quick timeline. Presidio is established in 1776. In 1822, Mexico gets its independence from Spain. And for most of these frontier soldiers out here, all that really meant was one flag went down and another flag went up. The tactics, the mission was all pretty much the same. Keep peace on the frontier, and unfortunately go after Native Americans who fled the mission system and bring them back. Sometimes punish them, put them to work constructing the Presidio. In 1835, Mexico decided that they would move the garrison to Sonoma. Why Sonoma? Those pesky Russians had established an army post at a place called Fort Ross, hence the name the Russian River. And they wanted the Mexican soldiers to be closer. A tiny garrison, at one point only one person was left behind to maintain the Presidio itself. In 1846, when the United States and Mexico went to war, the real fighting, of course, took place in Mexico. In California, a U.S. Navy ship sailed in 1846, and they pulled down the Mexican flag and raised the American flag over what's now Portsmouth Square. Then they came to the Presidio, took control, moved into the barracks. And from 1846 until 1995, this was the longest active military post in the United States, actually 1776 to 1995. Oh, and just for fun, the circle, there's the Comandancia. The original boundaries of the Presidio of San Francisco, they were huge. The entire northwest corner of San Francisco, shown inside the dotted line, starting from Alcatraz down to the ridge of Pacific Heights, all the way down to about where the zoo is, if you're familiar with San Francisco, was the original Presidio as claimed by the United States. I don't think the Spanish ever had a boundary around the Presidio. It just seems to be that, hey, it's all Spanish land. Well, when the Americans came in, they wanted to formalize it. And this was taking way too much land. There were pushbacks between the city of San Francisco and the military and the U.S. government of what was really needed. And these are the final boundaries set up in 1876. There was still always pushback between the city of San Francisco that surrounded the Presidio on two sides of, the Army has too much. And there was what we would later call trespasses, where private citizens would try to build inside the Presidio of San Francisco. First, the Army would push them out. In later years, the National Park Service had to maintain watch over people building inside the Presidio. So a great sandstone wall was constructed around 2/3 of the boundary of the Presidio to say this is where it stops. This is our boundary, and that's where it is today. At the north, you'll notice a big meandering marshland. That was an area that was they call it a tidal slough or a swamp. We call it a wetland, and you'll see in later years we're going to great lengths to try to rehabilitate parts of that wetland that would disappear under fill in later years. Through the 1850s and the gold rush era, the Presidio was only manned by a couple of dozen soldiers. By the time the Civil War broke out in 1861, there were several hundred US troops assigned to the Presidio of San Francisco. Many of them were infantry troops, like shown here. And this is the main parade ground, unrecognizable today. And others were assigned to the fort at Fort Point. These were artillerymen. The job of the infantry would be to fight an enemy on land. The role of the artillery at Fort Point would be to sink any enemy ships trying to get into the harbor. Now, there was never any action out here in California during the Civil War, but there were tremendous fears because California, though nominally a Union state, had a large percentage of Southern sympathizers. Some of them were actively, openly Confederates who wanted to overthrow the government in California, specifically to turn San Francisco Bay and its resources and the silver and gold coming out of the Comstock lode in Sierra Nevada, turn it to funding the Confederate cause. They never, although was talk, there were never any open acts of rebellion. Anyone who opened their mouth was pretty much locked up by the army and sent out to Alcatraz. But they didn't know that there wasn't going to be action. There were at one time 500 soldiers assigned to Fort Point. Many of these soldiers, they were volunteers. Real experienced regular army soldiers were needed on the East Coast and the battlefields. So California volunteers were assigned to Fort Point and to the Presidio, where they maintained the cannon, maintained watch. They would travel out from the Presidio, the artillerymen. They'd patrol the frontier. And when the Civil War ended, without the old expression, without ever firing a shot in anger, the Presidio became more formalized as the central major military post on the west coast of the United States. It was, although it was much more developed, San Francisco had about 50,000 people living in it at the start of the Civil War. This was still a long ways from nowhere from the rest of the United States. There was no transcontinental railroad yet. There were no roads to speak of, just rutted wagon routes crossing the endless, what they call the Great American Desert. To sail from the East Coast to San Francisco took 3 or 4 months. And being posted out here, it was really a frontier post, still well into the late 19th century. A series of photographs were taken by the famous pioneer photographer Edward Muybridge in 1869. And these photos show the barren, windswept Presidio. People hated being posted here during the 1860s and early 1870s. It was windswept, sandy, no vegetation, and it became sort of an unofficial destination for people in San Francisco taking a Sunday outing to drive out and enter the main gate of the Presidio on the left, watch the soldiers drilling. There would be artillery practice. That always drew bunches of people. Upper right, a hospital. This was the only permanent hospital building in the far west. It was called Wright General Hospital. And it had a capacity of no more than a couple of dozen patients at a time. But stout brick construction compared to the wood frame construction for most of the other army posts and the other buildings in the Presidio. This would reflect the Army's growing permanence. This was no longer a temporary frontier post. This was settled. This is the Presidio of San Francisco. And A lot of work went into making it as attractive as they possibly could. One of the more charming things to me about the Presidio is this upper street scene. This is was called Officers Row. A dozen look-alike sort of neoclassical cottages. This was built for the officers assigned to the Presidio of San Francisco, and it still exists today. Much greener and more elegant looking. But there's this is the biggest collection of Civil War vintage buildings in California, and also the oldest street scene in San Francisco, because this wasn't destroyed during the 1906 earthquake. In the late 19th century, as the Presidio settled down, as accommodations got better, and especially as the place got landscaped, this became a much better duty station. In fact, by the turn of the 20th century, the Presidio was good duty, a very good duty, especially for the officer class. The officers always lived a good life in the Presidio of San Francisco, and being in a major metropolitan area, these folks were part of the upper crust of society, not in terms of money, but in terms of their background. Many of the officers, the vast majority were West Point graduates, probably came from old families on the East Coast. The enlisted guys, while they didn't have the social status, of course, of the officers, it was good duty for them because of what they used to call the flesh pots of North Beach and the Barbary Coast. It was a good liberty town, although it was a fairly good hike over the sand dunes from the Presidio. So before long, a series of saloons and houses of dubious repute popped up outside the entrance gate to the Presidio on Lombard Street. One of the big changes happened in the early 1880s. The Army, both to make the Presidio a more attractive place for the troops and the officers to reside, and also to make a statement that, yes, this is the US government and we're here to stay, they began planting an urban forest. There was a US Army landscape architect who saw the planting of tens of thousands of trees, mostly eucalyptus and cypress. And Major Jones, became known as the Jones Plan. That was the origin of the forest that covers so much of the Presidio today. Old Fort Point never fired a shot in anger, but it was obsolete by the end of the Civil War. In the 1890s, a whole new technology was evolving, and that was what was called the coast artillery. These were modern-looking cannon mounted in massive concrete bunkers, and throughout the 1890s and into the 20th century, all the fortifications around Fort Point and the Presidio, and additionally over in the Marin Headlands, dozens of coast artillery batteries were established. The potential enemy was anyone that had a fleet in those days, although the thinking always was, you never know about the British. So we built our fortifications to handle the biggest and most powerful ships the British had. Also in the 1890s, the post went on a even more permanent construction binge, and a series of these wonderful brick barracks that still line Montgomery Street in the Presidio. These were constructed between 1894 and 1897. Each one of these buildings could house 200 soldiers. So there was enough residents just in this barracks row for an entire regiment, over 1,000 enlisted men. Coast Guard, and the Presidio had virtually every branch of the military assigned to it, with the exception of modern armor tanks. But you had, in this case, you had coast artillery soldiers, you had infantry soldiers, you had cavalry, you had air corps. The Presidio had many different roles and it had many different lives. Maybe some of the most famous guys that were assigned here. Enlisted men, in this case, infantry, but also the famous Buffalo Soldiers. These were in the old segregated army. The 9th Cavalry, they were here from 1902 to 1904. And one of their roles was to go out every spring and patrolled the national parks, Yosemite, Sequoia, Kings Canyon. There was no National Park Service, there were no rangers, so it fell on the cavalry and the Buffalo Soldiers to patrol, do improvements, build roads, do infrastructure, chase out squatters from the young national parks. In 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out, and the Presidio became the staging ground where thousands of troops mustered and were trained. And these weren't regular army soldiers. This was in addition. These guys that came for the Spanish-American War, they were pretty much all volunteers. There was Tennessee, and there was Illinois, and it just went on and on and on. They lived in giant tent camps. They underwent training, waiting until the time when they would march out the Lombard Street Gate and then head down to the waterfront in San Francisco to sail off to the Philippines. The way it worked out is by the time they arrived at the Philippines, the brief fighting was over. Spain had capitulated. The Filipinos were just, they had been fighting for their independence for years against Spain. They saw the Americans as their liberators. Well, wrong. The Americans became the new occupying force. And essentially, the Filipinos carried on with their fight for independence in what the Americans called the Philippine Insurrection. And historians today realizing that one man's insurrection is another man's freedom fight. It's now called the Philippine-American War. And it dragged on for several years till 1902. And soldiers kept being processed through the Presidio. And then when they returned, they'd be processed and mustered out. 1906, the Army rose to the mission when much of San Francisco was initially rattled, shaken, and partly destroyed by earthquake, and then firestorms that blew up afterwards. About 550 square blocks of San Francisco were burned out. 250,000 people were homeless, and the Army enforced a martial law, very controversial. And they also opened up their warehouses where a lot of the equipment from the Spanish-American War and the insurrection were still in storage. And tent camps were set up around San Francisco. The Army, if nothing else, they definitely knew how to set up a tent camp, take care of sanitation, food distribution. And the Army later on would operate 21 refugee camps scattered around San Francisco until folks could rebuild their city. The waterfront of the Presidio was in that early map, they called it a tidal slough. Well, it was decided that to celebrate the rebuild of San Francisco and nominally to celebrate the completion of the Panama Canal, San Francisco was chosen to host a World's Fair in 1915 called the Panama Pacific International Exposition, real mouthful. And although the Panama Canal was supposedly the impetus for the fair, everyone knew that it was to celebrate San Francisco's rebirth. A lot of it was along the shore in the Presidio. The Army worked out a deal with the fair developers that the marshlands would be filled with dredge from the bottom of the bay. This were a lot of the temporary exhibits, and there's a giant in the lower photo. You can tell there's a racetrack. These were constructed, and then at the end of the fair, the buildings were demolished, the land returned to the Army. Start to get aerial photographs. This one taken about 1920. The main parade ground, the main post is at Upper Center, and there along the shore of the bay, where once upon a time there had been exhibition buildings during the World's Fair. That's a sea of barracks. The Presidio was a major training post for doughboys in World War I, training before they were shipped off to the battlefields of France. Now the Presidio is going to look like the Presidio we know. Although this picture was taken in the 1930s, you can clearly see the stands of cypress and pine trees that have been planted. Now they're mature. The main parade ground is at the left center. And if you look at the very top, you can see the dome of the Palace of Fine Arts still standing. It said the Presidio had many different roles. It had many different tasks. And by the 1930s, there were actually 4 different army posts within the Presidio of San Francisco. To try to explain the Presidio of San Francisco, 1,491 acres, it had a commanding officer. But areas were sawn out of the interior of the Presidio. One of them became Crissy Army Airfield, which was built in 1920. So the guy who was the post commander of the Presidio was sort of the landlord to an Army airfield. And the Crissy Army Airfield is, after those barracks were cleared, the old filled land from the World's Fair, now it was an airfield. The role of the aviators flying out, initially it was a coast defense air station. They were part of the coast artillery. They were the flying eyes, if you will, who were scouting out any approaching enemy ships. They would radio back in the early radios. That was called the fall of shot, when the big cannons fired. And they also had roles. They spotted for firefighting. They did aerial photography. It wasn't really a fighter base. This was called a coastal defense base. And the rising towers of the Golden Gate Bridge in the 1930s kind of spelled the end of this as a useful airfield, because the Golden Gate Bridge was right in the takeoff path. So in 1936, the planes moved to the then new and expansive Hamilton Field up in Marin County, right near where I live. Another Army post. You define an Army post, does it have its own flagpole and does it have its own commanding officer? Well, Crissy Field had a commanding officer and a flagpole. So did Letterman General Hospital, established in the 1899 to handle people from the Spanish-American War. It was the major hospital. It replaced the old Wright Hospital I showed you earlier. This one handled people from the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Philippines, long-term care. It reached its height during World War II, when in 1945 alone, they had 73,000 admissions. Hospital ships would come into San Francisco, they'd dock, trains would carry the wounded to the Presidio, and they'd be treated at Letterman Hospital. Fort Winfield Scott, another flagpole, another commanding officer. This was where the big Coast Artillery guns were located, and it was the home of the Coast Artillery branch, which it no longer exists anymore. Coast Artillery was phased out after World War II. And then to complicate things, you had semi-military. You had the Coast Guard station and rescue station at Fort Point, and you had the Public Health Service Hospital. I interviewed at base closure one of the former base commanders of the Presidio. I said, how did you manage all of these things? And he said it was sort of like chasing cats off a flat car. You know, they jump off at one end, jump on and the other. He was being asked. He felt like he was the mayor of a small city. Following World War I, it was a good time at the Presidio. Peacetime, there was the largest group of soldiers were the 30th Infantry. They were there from 1918 to 41. They were called San Francisco Zone. They were there through the Depression. It was a good time to be in the military. 3 hots on a cot, you got paid. And San Francisco, as I said, always a good liberty town. This is going to change in December 7th, 1941. The Presidio became the center for the headquarters for the coastal fortifications that defended San Francisco. All the gun batteries were manned by early afternoon on December 7th. But it was also the headquarters for what was called the Western Defense Command. Soldiers were pouring into San Francisco for training and for deployment to defend the coast. And the guy who was the general in charge, Lieutenant John DeWitt, he was in charge of all the defense of the West Coast, not only the Coast Artillery, but invasions and security. And he was absolutely convinced that the tens of thousands of Japanese Americans and Japanese who lived along the Pacific coast, they were all potential terrorists. And he convinced the federal government to have FDR issued an executive order, the Executive Order 9066, which was issued 3 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. it essentially said that everybody living in the defensive area, which was west of the Sierra Nevadas, they could be relocated if they were considered to be a security threat. The executive order never said Japanese, but this is how the announcement came out that was issued by the Fourth Army, Western Defense Command under John DeWitt. And 120,000 Japanese Americans were relocated, 20,000 just in San Francisco. Those soldiers at the bottom loading people onto cars, those are Fourth Army soldiers, probably signed to the Presidio of San Francisco, not looking very happy at moving women and kids, children in their baggage. The end of World War II, the Presidio starts a long phase out when it's no longer really defensive site, it's more an administrative and command site. And the 6th U.S. Army was headquartered beginning in 1946. There was a missile base, little known, but there was a Nike missile base located in the Presidio. And the enemy now, it was theoretically, it would have been the Soviet Union, Russian Bear bombers flying over San Francisco. There were a dozen sites like this that surrounded San Francisco. This little one in the Presidio, this would be the last active fortification, if you will. The 1960s was a really turbulent time. Anti-war sentiment ran high. The Presidio became the target of a lot of anti-war demonstrations. Soldiers in the Presidio were being trained and deployed to Vietnam. Here at the main Lombard Gate, protesters trying to force their way in, MPs blocking the way. It was becoming obvious that the Presidio was more and more of a ceremonial base. There were not that many enlisted active anymore, but there was a lot of command people. There were a lot of administrative. The 6th Army was in charge of training, and it was in charge of logistics. For example, during the first Gulf War in the early 1990s, they coordinated with the reserve and guard units to be transferred and supplied to Saudi Arabia, rather the Near East, to take part in the first Desert Storm. Some of the soldiers in the Presidio ended up wearing patches from the Desert Storm, even though it turns out they never left the Presidio, but if you were involved in the command activities, you got to wear the patch showing service in a combat zone. So what happened? In 1988, the Army got the word, actually the Department of Defense got the word, Congress had passed a law that they wanted to shut down a bunch of military properties. They wanted to shut down over 50 major military facilities as a base closure and realignment act. The idea being you'd close down the Army posts and they would either be sold off or transferred to other government agencies. And San Francisco was hit really hard when the base realignment closure, we'll call it BRAC, when it was announced in late 1988. It included Mare Island, it included Hamilton Airfield, included Alameda Naval Air Station, Treasure Island Naval Station, and this shocked everybody, the Presidio of San Francisco. It was always sort of assumed that even though the Presidio wasn't an active defensive site, its long cultural history, the longest Army post in the US, it would be always going to be maintained as like the old Ironsides of the Army, right? Culture, history, nope. Congress said it closes, and it was inarguable. Even though local folks were against the closure, it was going to happen. What people didn't realize, it almost got slipped through the cracks, was way back in 1972, 16 years earlier, Congress had passed another bill called a bill to create a Golden Gate National Recreation Area that included vast areas of open space around San Francisco, including military bases that were then active. And there was a line in there that essentially said, if these military bases become excess to the defensive need, they'll transfer to the National Park Service. And that's what happened. There was no chance the Presidio was going to be sold to developers, much to their dismay. It was going to transfer to the National Park Service. And it happened. There was a 6-year lag time. But on October 1st, 1994, or there 5 years of lag time between base closure and the day the soldiers left. And in a very moving ceremony, the soldiers of the 6th Army, there was a major flag lowering event for base closure. And at noon on October 1st, 1994, the Army lowered the flag from the main flagpole for the last time. And immediately, National Park Rangers raised the flag back up. The Presidio had changed command, if you will. It was no longer a military site, it is now a park site. It was for the people. Initially, the 6th Army was still active. They had only a small need for real estate inside the now downsized Presidio, and it was thought that they'd stay there for another 10 years or so. Instead, the Army decided to, Presidio's closed, well, let's just shut down the 6th Army too. And in June 1995, the last vestige of military activity in the Presidio ended when the 6th Army left. The National Park Service was looking at maintaining nearly 470 historic structures, 800 buildings totaled throughout the Presidio, infrastructure, police, fire department, and everything else. It was all National Park Service, and Congress was afraid that the Park Service might not be able to carry out that much administrative. So in 1998, they created a new agency called the Presidio Trust to lease out properties in the Presidio. It gets a little complicated. So remember how I said that the commanding officer of the Presidio had all these other commands underneath him that he didn't control, but he was like landlord to? Well, that's how the Presidio Trust was arranged. The Presidio Trust is a management company. The National Park Service, Department of Interior, my old agency, owns and controls the Presidio, and the Presidio Trust manages the land inside 80% of the Presidio. Their mission, make the Presidio run in the black. Do not have the Presidio be a drag on the US taxpayers. This map here, the blue dotted line, the outside of the dotted line, that's areas administered solely by the National Park Service. That's where the Crissy Field and the wetlands and the coastal bluffs and all the great beaches are located. Inside, where all the buildings are located, that's Presidio Trust. A lot of them, and Congress authorized money to the Presidio Trust to help them get off the ground. The idea of the Presidio Trust was, we're going to give you money to rehabilitate buildings, get tenants in, start to turn a profit. If you don't turn a profit in 15 years, Congress says, we will consider delegislating that part of GGNRA and removing the Presidio so it can be sold to private developers. Well, the Presidio Trust has been a raging success. Houses like this, these ones that were built for pilots at Crissy Field, highly desirable rental properties in San Francisco. Old industrial buildings like this old heavy equipment house was built to manage Nike missiles and their launchers. It's turned into a climbing center and a gym inside. The old Public Health Service hospital, which was also closed, that was turned into senior residential facilities. I especially like the rehabilitation of the old buildings to give them a new life. This one here was bachelor officers' quarters where young unmarried officers lived. It made a perfect B&B, and now it's called the Inn at the Presidio. There are no breaks here. No one's getting cut rate stuff because this is the Presidio or inside National Park land. The mission of the trust is to make the Presidio run in the black, and it does now. That means you pay market rate. For example, a night here at the Inn at the Presidio might run $450, $500. Rents for some of those pilot houses are probably, I haven't checked today, but they're probably in the vicinity of $5,000, $6,000 a month. Some of the generals' houses are renting for double-digit thousands every month, and the money goes back into the maintenance of the Presidio. And obvious why the location is so popular. These are those old barracks on the main parade ground. They've been rehabilitated too. One of them is another B&B called the Lodge at the Presidio. And then one of them is the Walt Disney Family Museum. Disney money paid to rehabilitate that building. But it's not just structures. There's also natural resources in the Presidio. There's the huge urban forest, which is maintained by foresters and uh, tree crews. We're also going through the process of opening long buried streams. Streams and creeks in the Presidio were convenient dumping grounds in the 19th century. Well, we're digging that stuff out and we're recreating some of the natural ecosystems in the Presidio. This area here, this was a buried creek that ran from El Poland Spring to the bay. It was dug out, and this picture was taken during construction. Here's a picture taken 5 years later as it's being revegetated with native California vegetation. One of the biggest changes was after the 1989 earthquake, there was a freeway that crossed San Francisco. Highway 101 led to the Golden Gate Bridge. Although it didn't collapse, its safety rating was reduced to number 2 out of a rating of 100, and it had to come down. It was just a hazard waiting to happen. It was built in the 1930s before a lot of modern codes, and it was decided by jointly by Caltrans and by the state of California and the Park Service, and at that time the Army was still in charge, that it had to come down and be rebuilt. It was ugly. It had cut the Presidio in half, and it created, shady, nasty areas. The decision is, we're not just going to tear it down, rebuild it as it was. We're going to create something entirely new. And in one long weekend in April of 2012, just about every heavy piece of mechanical equipment that could do demolition in California came to the Presidio and tore down Doyle Drive. And over the course of the next several years, an entirely new approach to the Golden Gate Bridge was built called Presidio Parkway. Instead of now 3 lanes in each direction, it was now 4 to 5 lanes in each direction. Instead of elevated, it was brought down to ground level, and in 2 areas, tunnels were constructed so that it no longer cut the Presidio in 2. Now, man-made land was created on top of what, I love the term, they're called the tunnel tops, because that's exactly what they are. It's over 14 acres of new land were constructed, and it's been wildly popular. It opened in 2022, and they're estimating maybe 1 million people a year come and are using this. Kids' playgrounds, dance recitals, concerts, flying a kite, either informal or formalized recreation. I tell people, come to the Presidio today. Come for the history if you want, but enjoy the modern Presidio. It's your park. It has a new life. There's, in addition to historic buildings and trails and waterfront, there's 24 miles of trails. There's got 60,000 trees. So I said we have our own forestry department. But something else I urge too, to wrap, remember that people have come before us, and many people gave their lives, gave their careers to protecting this land, to make it available for us and for future generations. And 30,000 interments at the San Francisco National Cemetery, forever overlooking the Golden Gate. Whew. Okay, that's the Presidio in 50 minutes. And these are the folks that helped me, and I will now turn off screen sharing. And let's see if any have any questions.
Of course, we got questions. Nice job, John.
Thank you.
Your slides are spectacular. As I said in my preface, it's one of my favorite places to go. And the juxtaposition between the rich history that's there and the way the park is used now is just really cool. So let's get back to some of the history that's there. Letterman Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And George Lucas. What's the connection there?
Okay. Letterman Hospital, it evolved out of that wood frame that building that show you built in the 1890s, early 1900s. By the end of the Vietnam War, it was a huge complex. There was a high-rise hospital building, either 6 or 8 stories. There were any number of laboratories surrounding it, and Letterman was ordered closed along with the rest of the Presidio, and it left this huge medical empty facility. The Park Service initially tried to get, hey, any medical group want to take it over, and it turned out the building wasn't up to modern codes, both seismically and also to the interior couldn't handle a lot of modifications for modern, like um, uh, radiology and all. So it was decided tear it down. And a basic guideline in the Presidio under the Park Service is no new construction, or rather no new additional square footage. So it was decided, since this building's going to come down, anybody want the site? And George Lucas said, ooh, yes, I have an idea. Want to turn it into a digital media center. And George Lucas constructed the Lucas Digital Arts campus on the site of the old Letterman Hospital. And he did it very sensitively. It's a lot of brick. It echoes the big barracks buildings on the main parade ground. And when you do this, you're not building your private building. You're building a building on government land, and eventually that land's going to be returned. And I think he got like a 99-year lease. So, but probably be renewed.
So let's stay with popular culture since we're talking about Lucas. Film work at the Presidio,
Yeah,
movies.
movies.
Tell me about movies.
Oh boy, there was a silent film made in the Presidio in the about 1920 about some officer's daughter having a love affair with a young officer, and dad didn't approve. One of the classic stories. It's been the state of any number of there have been chase scenes have been filmed through the Presidio. There was a Humphrey Bogart movie called Dark Passage, where there's Bogart gets involved with a fist fight and somebody on a bluff overlooking Fort Point. It was destroyed by a monster several times. The Golden Gate Bridge and the Presidio have been attacked. My favorite is there was a movie called The Presidio, starring Sean Connery. And that was filmed on the Presidio in the late 1980s. And what's great about it is they used real soldiers and real sites, and it really captures what the Presidio looked like in the late 20th century for posterity. And on the other end of it, it's appeared in a couple of, what was it? The movie Point Blank, Lee Marvin, 1967. A drug deal is supposed to go down in the Presidio, and they actually landed a helicopter in the courtyard of Fort Point, which was just an astounding bit of aviation. Film buffs watch it just for that one scene.
So, you know what struck me? Because the same thing happens on the East Coast in those early explorer days, is on a foggy day, you could just kind of blow past a place like San Francisco Bay or Monterey or the Chesapeake Bay or Delaware Bay. And that's exactly what happened with those early explorers from the on those expeditions coming out to look for Monterey Bay.
Yeah. Part of the reason that the bay went undiscovered by Europeans, air quotes here, was the coastline in California. If you're going from north to south, and there was a regular trading route that started in the 16th century from the Philippines across the North Pacific and then down the North American coast. When you come north to south, you go around Point Reyes, the jutting headland, and then the coast cuts in, and ships didn't want to cut in close to the coast. They kept going in a straight line down towards the Monterey area, and they just stayed so far out at sea that the gap of the Golden Gate Bridge is essentially invisible, because behind it, you've got the hills of Contra Costa County, literally the other coast, and you have Alcatraz and Angel Island. And if the fog's in, good luck.
Yeah.
It just, yeah, just a, no need to go there. We know there's nothing worth exploiting up here. The few times the Spanish did land in the 16th century, they were kind of disappointed. They were hoping for more giant pyramids and people dripping with gold, and the folks they met up here were pretty much subsistence culture. So they focused their energy on Central and Mesoamerica.
Yeah. Yeah, and it would have been, I mean, it's a dangerous coastline anyway if you're on a
Mm-hmm.
ship at sea. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
to stay out of harm's way would probably be not a bad idea. So you've gotten a lot of people that have come in saying what a great program this was. I would like to echo that. Thanks for being with us. That's it for questions for us. And thank you, John, for being with us this morning, and thank you all for viewing this morning. If you missed any of our earlier programs, including John's on the Golden Gate Bridge, you can find them by visiting the museum's website at museumsrv.org. Today's program, John's program, will appear early next week. No news for most of you, but you are an earthquake country. So join us on February the 20th, Thursday at 11:30 when Dr. David Schwartz will outline for us the earthquakes and fault lines in the San Ramon Valley. You've got almost a month now to run around the house and put things in proper order for that. If you like these programs and want them to continue, we ask that you make a donation by going to the museum's homepage, museumsrv.org, and clicking on the Donate Now button. The museum's also in need of volunteers. If you can give us some time, please contact us. And on behalf of myself and the museum, I want to wish you a happy new year. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Again, thank you, John, for bringing that to us. Stay safe, you all, and thank you for watching.
Bye-bye.